Alright guys, today we're going to be talking about Standard 4.1. I'm really sorry I don't have a little video down at the bottom, but I'm on the wrong computer for that. But I think this will be relatively painless, so let's talk about it. As you can see, Standard 4 really is about the rise of industry and how it impacts the United States. Now, think about this. Before the Civil War, and even right after it, the United States is primarily agricultural. Like, mostly what we're doing is growing crops, okay? There is some industry there, but that's not most people, okay? If you look around the United States today, though, we do grow crops, but most people don't work in the agriculture business. Most people work in industry. So how did we get there? How did that change our society, and how did government deal with those things? That's really what we're talking about in Standard 4, and I think that we're going to have to lay a little groundwork with Standard 4.1 so that the rest of it makes sense. In order to talk about how the country grew industrially, we've really got to talk about where we got all these resources from, and that largely was the West. And to talk about how we got resources from the West, we've got to talk about the railroad. So let's pick that up, and I think we'll be in good shape. So during the Civil War, of course, the South wasn't showing up to Congress to vote. Okay, and so basically that means that the North could do whatever they wanted to do. One of the things that happens is that the North allows Congress or the government to get a whole lot stronger than it had been before. And one example of how that worked was with the Transcontinental Railroad. You see, before the Civil War, there was a lot of tension over, should there be a railroad that's built at all? Is that something the government should invest in? Or should we just allow the railroad companies to do it on their own? And then secondly, if we do have a railroad, should it be built through the North or through the South? Well, without the South in Congress, the North, says, let's build it, and let's build it through the North. That seems like a really good plan. So the Northern Congress passes two specific laws, the Homestead Act and the Pacific Railway Act. The Pacific Railway Act is a pretty simple one. It gives a bunch of land to railroad companies and says, you can do two things with this. You can either lay track, moving out to the west so we can connect the eastern coast to the Pacific Ocean, and that's one option. Or you can sell that land that we've given you to raise money so that you can lay track, because the government doesn't have a whole lot of money to give them. They're fighting a war, so of course their money is tied up elsewhere, but they have lots of land. So railroad companies are buying it up. Now there's another problem, and that is that we have to get people out to the west to make this a viable option. So the government says, let's just give a bunch of land away. And they passed the Homestead Act. This one says, we're going to give land to farmers who are willing to build a home there. This encourages people to move out in huge numbers. Now, this picture looks a little bit crazy, like not something that's real, but it really, really was. They actually would have basically a race to claim the land that you want. They'd say, meet here at noon on a certain day, we'll fire off a gun, and whoever's the first to plant their stake in a certain square of land will get that land. There's actually a movie called Far and Away from the 90s that included one of these land rush races, I guess you'd call it. I'll try to include a link to that particular scene down in the video clip, or in the comments of this video. It's got Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman in it, and it's worth watching. It's maybe not the best movie in the world, but it's enjoyable. So anyway, I'll put that down in the comments, and maybe that'll help you visualize what would actually happen. And because the Transcontinental Railroad does get built, the regions of the United States are linked in a way they weren't before. If you were Southern before, you would only ever really talk to Southerners unless you wanted to travel for days and days and days. That's no longer the truth, or no longer the case. It would also bring settlers west, so the West is starting to get settled. It would bring goods from the North and the South to those Western settlers so they could get pots and pans and guns. And then the people who were in the West, in the frontier, could ship crops, things that they grew, or resources like coal, things they mined, back to the East. So we're connected in a way we never had been before. Now, there is a downside to all this, and that is what happens to the Native Americans. Now, the short version of this is that the railroad is bad for Native Americans, but of course, I need to give you a little bit more detail. One of the big issues with the Native Americans is that they largely lived off of the buffalo or the bison. They used every part of the buffalo to live. So they'd use the horns for some things. They'd use the intestines for some things. They even use buffalo poop. They call it buffalo chips as fuel because it burns relatively well, and they could get fires started that way. But the bison would mess up railroad track. They'd chew on it. They'd try to sharpen their horns on it. They'd stand on it. And of course, a train hitting a buffalo is not going to be a good thing. And so the railroad companies would actually pay people per buffalo head to go out and kill them. So you get guys who go out there and they're just killing buffalo left and right. The problem is that these Indians need the buffalo, and so they can't sustain themselves, and they're slowly going to have to move to find more buffalo. Now, this is just one instance in a long history that we've had with the Native Americans. You remember the Trail of Tears, where we forced the Cherokee from Georgia to Oklahoma against their will because we found resources on their land? So already they don't really trust us too much, and now we're killing the buffalo, so of course they hate us. As we move west, we force Native Americans into bad treaties and put them onto reservations. There are even some treaties or sometimes that we would go and say, hey, here's a gift for you guys, and we give them blankets. And in the blankets, we would have basically used those blankets previously for people who had smallpox. So now the blankets are infected with smallpox, the Native Americans get it, and they would die. Not a good thing. We're really not treating these guys well at all. Once we put Native Americans on reservations, if we found resources there, we'd drive them off again. So, of course, some of the Native Americans are going to fight this, and you get the Indian Wars. Basically, with the Indian Wars, some tribes are going to say, I'm not giving up my land. They grab guns and spears and get on their horses, and they try to fight. But we have more horses and more guns and bigger artillery, and so our cavalry, which is our military mounted on horseback at the time, pursues them and wins and take their lands. Now, yes, there are going to be some Native American victories. They do beat us from time to time, but the overall trend is that the United States Army is going to win. And eventually the Indians are forced onto reservations. Yep. Now, a lot of people in the East start to look at this and say, we are not doing really good things here. We're making treaties and then we're not really keeping our word because we force people onto into land they don't want to be on. So because of this, we create a brand new policy, and that is one of assimilation. Assimilation means that we're going to take someone and make them adopt another culture. So, for example, when you came to Southside, not Southside, sorry, that was the school I used to teach at. When you came to GMC, you probably assimilated into the GMC culture. What do I mean by that? Well, you dress like other people here because we have a dress code, and you speak like other people do here because now you know what Blazer Black is, or SLCs, or The Deck. If you say that to someone at a different school, like, say, Southside, they're not going to have any idea what you're talking about, but you've assimilated, you've adopted the culture of Greer Middle College. So a law is passed that basically says, fine, let's do this assimilation thing. Let's take the land, let's divide up the reservations and give it to the Indian family head. That could be basically the father. And we'll give him 160 acres, but the catch is he's got to act like a good white citizen. You like how it's in quotation marks because that's a little being facetious there. For 25 years. And if you can do that, good for you, you can keep the land. Now that might sound like an easy price to pay for a whole bunch of land, but can you think about giving up your religion and your language and the dress that you wear and, I mean, just everything, the food you eat for 25 years? This is really questionable and was not a popular law with the Native Americans, as you might imagine. In this law, often Native American children would be taken from the West and sent to boarding schools in the East to learn how to be white. So imagine that your son is taken away and he looks like this, and he comes back maybe 5 years later, maybe 10 years later, and he looks like this. And he thinks that you are a backwards savage, which is what they were taught in the East. This is a really ridiculous and heinous law, but this is how we treated these folks. Now, there are a couple problems with this in addition to the fact that it's unethical. One is that the Native Americans didn't believe that they could individually own land. They believed that either everyone owned it together or that the tribe as a whole owned it. And so when you say this 160 square acres or 160 acres is your territory, that doesn't really register for them. Not only that, but we basically said you're going to have to live here and farm because you can't farm on someone else's land. So farm within these 160 acres. They didn't farm. They were primarily hunters. Because of this, the government takes back a whole lot of land, about 93 million acres. And you can see over here on the right that it largely ends up getting sold to white people for very, very little money. I don't know if you can make it out in the video you're watching, but you could buy some land in Montana for about $9.86 an acre, and there were 11 million acres for sale. Or maybe that's 11,000. I don't know why there are only 2 zeros there. Anyway, a lot of land that's taken directly from Native Americans. So the Native Americans, of course, are going to look for any way that they can revitalize their culture, and there is more to this story, but I'll spare you for the sake of time. And basically, the Native Americans are, there's this idea that springs up within their culture that if they dance in a particular way, they'll communicate with their ancestors. Their ancestors will come back and drive out the white men peacefully, just make them want to leave. This is not a war dance. They figure this is their last-ditch effort, but the white guys see this and think, oh my goodness, this is a threat. They need to be killed. This must be a war dance. They're about to invade us. And so there are a number of attacks on the Native Americans. One of the most heinous is the massacre at Wounded Knee. Wounded Knee is a creek that the Indians are actually surrendering at. They are willing to basically go onto the reservations, and so they're surrounded by the army. They're being rounded up, and as they're being rounded up, a gun goes off. And the gun goes off, and the other army guys say, oh no, there's a gun, and so they fire. And by the time it's done, you've got about 200 men, women, and children who have been killed. And so here you've got a picture where they're just standing in the mass grave where they buried them. This is kind of the last straw, because the Native Americans say, boy, we can't even surrender without you guys killing us, so whatever, you guys are crazy, we'll go onto the reservation. And this is really atrocious. Now, that is the end of Standard 4.1. I would be happy to answer any questions you have. You can email me at ngallion@greermiddlecollege.org. I hope this is helpful. Bye.